Hello? Anyone out there ready for scary stories in Bourbon? If you're out there, say where you're from and what bourbon you're drinking tonight. Hi, Beth. Hi, Laura. Hi, Debbie. Donnie. Hi. Becky. Hi. Kim. Hello. Laura Calhoun. Good to see you. Hello. So I just came right to the Magic Library tonight. Got all set up and ready to go. Hey, Stephanie, Tanya, Jessica, Bonnie. So if you're just checking in, make sure you tell people where you're from. Say hi. Give us a city and state. If you're from out of country, let us know. Hey, Laura Houston. Let us know what you're drinking tonight. If you're drinking bourbon, let us know. Hey, Greer, Cynthia. I switched up tonight. I'm doing some Basil Hayden, breaking into the good stuff. Mike, hi. Hi, Rebecca. Yeah, so tonight's the sixth night in our round of telling scary stories from America's most haunted neighborhood. Hi, Susan. And if you don't know anything about Old Louisville, Old Louisville is one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. Hi, Amanda, Dan, Barbara, Kenneth. We have 45 square blocks of old houses in Old Louisville, roughly 45 square blocks, roughly 1,400 structures. A lot of these places, they say, are reportedly haunted, so you can't go more than half a block without there being a reportedly haunted neighborhood. So we've been telling stories from one of my most recent ghost books. It's called True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. It's a kind of a compilation, an edited, a best of version of my first three books in the Ghosts of Old Louisville series. The last one was Haunts of Old Louisville. And before that was Phantoms of Old Louisville. We heard about the Pink Palace last night. Then the very first one, which came out in 2005, is Ghosts of Old Louisville. Recently, University Press of Kentucky acquired the rights to these, and they've reprinted them, so you can still get them. But if you want kind of one volume with most of the stories, it's this one, which just came out a couple years ago. So to help people pass the time during quarantine, every night at 9 o'clock, we're getting together, and I'm sharing some of my favorite stories from these books I've written, most of them from this book right here. You might know I do historic tours in the neighborhood during the day. We do history and architecture tours every day, 7 days a week from March 15th to November 15th at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. It's called Louisville Historic Tours. And at night, we do haunted history tours. So normally I'd be out on the streets of Old Louisville right now showing people some of the scary locations. But since we can't really do that, I decided just to get on Facebook Live and share some of the stories this way. So when the stories run out from this book, which will be in probably 3 or 4 more nights, then I will start reading from my memoir about the haunted house I used to live in, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. So we'll just read a half hour every night until we're through that and see what happens. Hopefully we'll be done with this all by then, but you never know. So hey everyone, if you're just checking in, hi Geneva, Ginny. Hey, Alice Jennings. Good to see you. Becky, Marcia, Suzanne. Like seeing a lot of people come back. If you're just checking in, hey, Sean. Check in and let people know where you are, where you're checking in from, city and state. Hey, Allie. Dimitri, Joel. Hi, good to see you. Susan Dallas. Glad you came back. And let people know what you're drinking tonight. So I got my Basil Hayden here. So cheers. We'll have our official toast and we'll start telling a couple stories. All right. So last night I told 2 stories that deal with St. James Court. And St. James Court is the heart of the neighborhood. There's a beautiful fountain there. It was installed in 1897. It's a statue of Venus rising from the sea. And 1 block to the south, you have our famous Pink Palace, which we talked about last night. 1 block to the north, you have our famous Conrad's Castle. which is a beautiful house museum. Since the 1980s, they've been offering tours. If you want to get inside one of these places in Old Louisville, the only place that's open for regular tours is the Conrad Caldwell House Museum at 1402 St. James Court. So when all this is over and done with, if you haven't done so, or if you haven't done so for a while, make plans to go tour the beautiful Conrad Caldwell House, a beautiful Richardsonian Romanesque mansion that was built in the 1890s. And if you do, be careful, because we learned last night there's a supposed ghost there, the ghost of Mr. Conrad, the man who built the house, one of 6 ghosts they say is haunting the place. But there's a couple other places on St. James Court that are haunted as well. And one of them involves the fountain that I had just mentioned. So one of the legends in Old Louisville centers on what they call the Ice Boy. And the Ice Boy is a ghostly ragamuffin that they see on cold, frosty nights. Very often it's the very first night of the year when frost hits or snow hits the ground. And people who've reported this apparition as having seen it, they say he looks maybe 7, 8, 9 years of age. He's a little boy. He's in tattered clothing, and he looks like he's dirty. He has soot and ash on his clothes. Looks like we might have connection problems again tonight, so if we get disconnected, I'll try to get back on. But they also see him right across the street. There's a beautiful condo building called the St. James Court Flats. And next to it is one of our famous walking courts. It's called Fountain Court. It goes out to 4th Street. And if you haven't been to Old Louisville, or in Louisville in general, we have these areas, not just in Old Louisville, but other neighborhoods, where instead of coming out your front door and finding a street with traffic running by your house, you come out your front door and there's a grassy kind of boulevard or a park-like setting where it's only sidewalks and walkways, gas lamps, and across the way you've got your neighbor's front door. So these are called walking courts or pedestrian courts. The most famous, the most charming is the original one from 1891 called Belgravia Court. But the second one is Fountain Court. And it goes from the fountain at the center of St. James Court to a gate on 4th Street, which was the original entryway to get into the Grand Southern Exposition that used to stand on what is now St. James Court. And so if they don't see the Ice Boy, this ghostly ragamuffin, around the fountain, they'll see him in the walking court, Belgravia Court, or else they'll see him in the foyer of the St. James Court Flats. And I talked to several different people who say they've actually seen this apparition. One was a man in the 1980s who lived in one of the condos there on Fountain Court. He was coming back from a wedding one night. It was the first snowfall of the year, and he was walking to his front door, and he noticed that there was a little boy kind of lurking around the fountain. And the fountain is turned off in the winter, but he kind of went to get a closer look, and he said he saw this apparition of what looked to be a young boy, dressed like for maybe 100 or 80 years ago, kind of just slowly walking around the fountain. His face was covered with what looked like dirt or soot and ash. His clothes were kind of tattered. He was obviously, a poor child. And other people have reported this apparition as well. When I was writing my book, I actually talked to 3 people who say they've seen this apparition, and the description is always the same. It's a young boy. They always say he's a ghostly ragamuffin. And it's always around the fountain, it's always in the walking court, or it's in the foyer of the St. James Court Flats. So I did some research, and turns out his haunting is connected to that building that stands there right at the fountain, the St. James Court Flats. So if you remember from my stories last night, we learned about Mr. Conrad. A lot of people considered him the neighborhood curmudgeon. If he wasn't suing the neighbors, they were suing him. He was always having conflict in the neighborhood. And one of them was because he built that big structure that's there at the fountain at Fountain Court. The St. James Court Flats was built by Mr. Conrad in 1897, and he built it as an investment property. And the thing is, when he announced that he had plans to build this grand apartment dwelling, he let the neighbors know that it was going to be 5 stories tall. And back then, the plan was that St. James Court, like most of the neighborhood, would be for single family dwellings. And in old Louisville, single family dwellings are usually no more than 3 stories. So when the neighbors found out there was going to be a 5-story building there on St. James Court, blocking out the sun and disturbing the view for the other mansions, they weren't very happy. They took him to court, and Mr. Conrad eventually prevailed. Supposedly he had friends who were judges, and they kind of sided with him. And he got the go-ahead and went ahead and built this 5-story building that had a little kind of annex at the top of the building, and the neighbors just kind of had to get used to it. They never quite forgave him. He died in 1905, but eventually the neighbors got their way because a cold February night in 1912, a terrible fire broke out on the top floor of the building. The story was a gentleman had been smoking a cigar, and he dropped the cigar, discarded it, and it caught some nearby draperies on fire. Other people said it was a disgruntled neighbor who set the fire as an act of arson, an act of revenge to get back at Mr. Conrad for building this building and kind of ruining the character of the neighborhood. So we're not quite sure what really happened. The official account is someone dropped a cigar and it caught the draperies on fire. But in any case, the whole top of the building was consumed in flame. And people were hanging out the windows. The fire brigades came, and it could have been a catastrophic fire, but they got everyone out. And the neighbors could have gloated because what happened is when the building was repaired, the new owner, he decided not to rebuild it with the upper floors as had been the original design. He removed the top floors, and in the end, there was just left a structure with 3 floors. So it was basically as tall as all the other houses on St. James Court. So in the end, the neighbors got what they wanted. They got nothing more than 3 stories tall, in the architectural line of buildings on St. James Court. And just so you know, here's an old picture of the fire that night in 1912. The fire brigade showed up. They had horses and wagons and water tanks. They pumped water up through hoses, and it helped put out the fire, but it was so cold, it was freezing, that, hey Tammy, hey Lisa, hey David, Kathy, Ryan, they say the water kind of froze over the building as it was pumped up, sprayed over the building, and the next morning, after the fire was extinguished and people were rescued, they said the whole building kind of turned into a giant stalagmite. It was like a big icicle rising from the ground. It was totally encrusted in ice. And here's the picture of the building the next morning. You can kind of see how it's crusted in ice. This is just the 3 bottom floors. But that's what the building looks like, or it looked like then. And this is what the building looks like today. I mean, you can't miss it. You go to the fountain at St. James Court, it's right there. But so in the end, the neighbors got what they wanted. They got nothing more than 3 stories tall on St. James Court. By then, Mr. Conrad had died, and people, thought that was that. But after they rebuilt the building, the next year, when the first snow fell, that's when people started reporting sightings of this ghostly apparition lurking around the fountain and running around the front door of the building and running through the walkways of Fountain Court. And they said it looked like a little orphan boy, a street urchin with tattered clothes, and he was dirty. It looked like he was covered in dirt. And this persisted for the next several years. It came to be like a regular tradition. Every time the cold weather rolled around, people said, oh, it's time for the ice boy to show up. So it went on that way for years, and the ice boy kind of became just part of the local fabric. He was one of the local legends. Well, hey, Ruth, and what happened was a couple more years passed, and it came time for the 10th anniversary of the rebuilding of the apartments at St. James Court. and they decided to have kind of a celebration. A band came and they were playing in a wooden pavilion on Fountain Court. City dignitaries came. The whole neighborhood, especially the St. James Court residents, turned out to celebrate, 10 years since the fire. And they were still kind of gloating that Mr. Conrad didn't get his way. It was only a 3-story building in the end. But they kind of tempered their gloating with the fact that they were happy that no one died in the fire, because people were trapped up there. They were hanging out the windows, and they managed to get everyone out. So they were just happy that no lives were lost. But the thing is, there was a rumor in the neighborhood that someone had died. No one was able to prove it, but they said a little boy had died, and they were kind of covering it up. Well, when the time came for this 10th anniversary celebration, when the mayor was at the podium kind of giving a speech and welcoming people, things were interrupted because a gypsy woman kind of emerged from the crowd, and that's when she announced that they shouldn't be having this kind of celebration because no one had acknowledged the ice boy. They still hadn't taken care of him. And that's when she kind of fed the flames of this rumor that indeed someone had died. And they said, you need to start telling the truth and talk about the young boy that died in this fire. And people kind of turned around and they were startled. They said, well, how would you know about a young boy and someone dying in the fire? And she said, I'd know because he was my son. And it turns out this gypsy woman lived several blocks to the west over in what was called the Cabbage Patch area. And this was kind of the poor part of the neighborhood, but they were known for their tenement farms and their huge cabbages and their great vegetables. Well, the story is, the rumor had been floating around that the night that the fire broke out, a young boy from this gypsy family, he had been out making grocery deliveries that night to earn some extra money for the family. And it was the coldest night of the year, February 12th, 1912. And he had dropped off this box of groceries at the apartment on the top floor, and it was freezing outside. He had been out running around, so he kind of huddled in the hallway. He was trying to warm up before he had to go out into the bitter cold. And he was up there when the fire broke out. And they say they never got to him. And the next morning, when they were kind of cleaning things out, they found his body huddled in a corner. And he had been probably overcome by smoke, but they said his clothing was burned. He was covered in soot and ash. The thing is, he wasn't from one of the wealthy local families. He wasn't from a St. James Court family. He was from the Cabbage Patch, the poor area nearby. So they never really wrote about his death in the newspaper as they would have, for the child of a more affluent family. And supposedly his ghost from that point forward started appearing, every year around the time of the fire to kind of look for this, recognition that he never got. And recently people have said they've seen him as well. I haven't seen him myself. I've done research. I've tried to substantiate the claims that a boy died in this fire, but I haven't found anything. The fire indeed did happen. There's no question about that. There's pictures of it. There's newspaper articles about the building. The whole story about Mr. Conrad and his conflict with the neighbors, that's all documented. But the fact that a young boy died in the fire, that's not been substantiated. So like a lot of these stories, it might be neighborhood legend, it might be lore, it might be something that did happen that kind of, evolved over the years. So for the time being, we'll never know, but it's a story that persists in the neighborhood, and it's one of the most kind of tragic stories because it involves a child. Another thing that's true, and I mentioned this one of our previous nights, there were a lot of gypsies in Louisville back in the day. I think I mentioned this. Back up to the 1920s and the 30s, Louisville was kind of considered gypsy headquarters for this part of the country. Because gypsies are often travelers, they move, they work with the seasons. So often what would happen is when spring rolled around, they'd move from the southern states up to the northern states where they'd look for work in the fields. They were known for working with horses, shoeing horses, grooming horses. They were tinkers. So going north, Louisville was a convenient stop about halfway there. So for Easter, for 2 weeks, they'd congregate on wood. For 2 weeks, they'd have big celebrations. They're covered wagons. They'd roast oxen and turkeys, have barrels of wine and bourbon. But they had a kind of dispute with the police in the 1930s, and that's when they kind of pulled up and decided not to come back. But they had their lawyers here in Louisville. They had their bank accounts here. There's a lot of newspaper articles about this. So this is something that is well documented. But when I read my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, I'll talk about that, and actually a descendant of one of the gypsies who lives in the city that told me a lot about this and kind of set me on the trail for that. So that was our first story tonight, The Legend of the Ice Boy, which is an apparition that is always seen around the fountain at St. James Court. So I see a lot of people checking in. So hi, Richard. Hey, Tracy. There's Margie. Margie lives on 3rd Street across from my old house. When we read Voodoo Day, she'll know a lot of the stuff firsthand because she lives near the apartment where one of the characters in my book lived. So it'll be fun to hear her chime in as she hears about this. But hi, Ashley and Michelle. So if you're just checking in, if you would, let people know where you're from. Say hi. Let us know what city and state you're from. If you're from out of country, great. Love getting people from Europe, Mexico. And let us know what you're drinking tonight. So I said I've got Basil Hayden. So now here's our toast to our second story, and we'll start in just a bit. And I hope everyone's doing okay. Kind of settling into what's the new normal. And like I said, if you're just tuning in, the plan is I'm going to be telling stories from my recent collection of ghost stories from old Louisville, America's most haunted neighborhood. And in a couple nights, probably 3 or 4 nights, I'll probably run out of stories that I know by heart, can tell them just off the cuff like I do on my tours that I normally be giving. And then I'll start reading my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, which is a really fun book, and it's my most recent book. My 12th book just came out a couple years ago. All right, so for our second story tonight, it's kind of like the Ice Boy. So it turns out in old Louisville, it's not just houses that are haunted, not just physical buildings that are haunted, but often there are, outdoor spaces. There's a ghost in Central Park. I don't know if any of you knew that, the ghost of Alfred Victor DuPont. There's a couple other places, but besides the fountain at St. James Court, but one of them is Brook Street. And there's a famous ghost story associated with Brook Street. So if you know anything about old Louisville, it's roughly, like I said, 45 square blocks. It's kind of like a rectangle tipped on its side. So there's a short side that faces the river, and it's roughly like 6 or 7 blocks by 10 or 12 blocks. And Brook Street is on the eastern side, right before you get to I-65, kind of where the neighborhood ends. You get over into Germantown and Smoketown. Well, the really wealthy part of the neighborhood was 3rd Street, 4th Street. That was the old Millionaires Row, Ormsby Avenue, and then St. James Court, which I've been talking a lot about. But Floyd, Brook, those were nice streets as well. They came after 2nd and 1st Streets. There were beautiful mansions over there. And some of them were torn down when they put I-65 in. The interstates destroyed a lot of city neighborhoods. Urban renewal was going on back then. They were tearing everything old down, putting up new things. So it really, changed the character of a lot of our downtown areas. But in any case, there's a story that the entire length of Brook Street is haunted by a phantom that looks to be the ghost of a female domestic worker from the 1800s. And people who've seen this apparition, they say she kind of looks like a maid from the 1800s. She's kind of in a gray, flouncy gown. She's got like a frilly apron over the front and kind of has one of those bonnets with frills around it. And in right around the end of the 1990s, they were going to tear down a beautiful school on Brook Street. It's called Old Male High School, and it sits there right next to I-65. Fortunately, the preservationists banded together. They saved it, and today it's kind of a community center. But some of the original sightings of what they call the Phantom of Brook Street were seen by students who were attending in the 1920s and 30s. I talked to a guy. This was about 2003. His name was Charlie Hutchins, and he had been a student in the late 1920s. And this isn't too far from 4th Street in downtown where the Seelbach is. And back in the day, 4th Street was the entertainment district. It's where the theaters were, all the good department stores and restaurants. So he and his friends could, take an hour and kind of go over to 4th Street and hang out. And that was like the heart of the city. Well, he said he was coming back with his friends one day, and they saw this apparition kind of floating down the street right in front of their school. And he said it looked like an old or a young woman in a gray maid's uniform with a frilly apron. One of his friends was getting some supplies from a closet. They were getting ready for their Christmas pageant, and he came out of the storage room to go back into the gym where they were setting up the stage, and there was this apparition in the hallway of a young girl in a gray dress with a white frilly apron. And the thing is, a lot of people reported the same apparition, but they said often she'd have her hands up over her face, or when she saw that people were coming, she'd kind of shriek and put her hands up over her face. And so I ran into a number of people who told me about this when I was researching my first book. Hey, Matt, no problem being late. You can watch this after the fact as well. I see Ray. Who else? Chuck. Welcome. But I talked to a woman. She had the most, her name was Hattie Sullivan. She had perhaps one of the most interesting encounters. She used to have an apartment right at the corner of Oak Street and Brook. And it was on the second floor of one of the old houses there. And, in the 60s and 70s, probably 80% of the mansions in old Louisville were turned into apartments. Fortunately, in the 1970s, 1975, when it became a historic preservation district, people began moving back down. So they've been restoring these, and now most of these are back to being single-family houses. But in the 60s and 70s, a lot of these were apartments. So this woman named Hattie, she had an apartment on the second floor. She was right at the corner of Brook and Oak. And she, every night she just loved to sit there and kind of look out her window and, watch, life go by. And if you know anything about Oak Street in old Louisville, that's where a lot of characters are. You never know what you're going to see on Oak Street. So she was there one night. It was a summer night. It was right after Derby, I think. It might have been maybe still late spring. But she was just sitting at her window, and she got this weird sensation, just got cold all of a sudden. And it kind of got dark outside. She thought a storm cloud had rolled in. And she looked down the corner towards Brook Street, and there was a big canopy of trees, and she noticed that under the tree canopy there was like a golden glow, like a radiant light kind of coming forward. She just stared, and this kind of apparition emerged from out of the shadows, and it looked like a maid with a frilly white apron. And the thing is, she said she noticed that this thing wasn't walking. It was like it was floating a lot along the sidewalk. And that's when she realized that it was like time had stopped, and she looked around and she couldn't see people around. It was like she was in a different dimension or something. But she just got this terrible feeling. She just turned icy cold. And that's when the thing, this apparition, kind of realized she was watching her, and this apparition looked up, and the apparition shrieked and put her hands up over her face. And Hattie said all of a sudden she just had this strange feeling. She wanted to go to the fireplace in the living room and light a fire. She didn't know why. She was freezing cold. She just wanted to light a fire, even though it was warm outside. And this thing, when it shrieked and put its hand up over her face, it disappeared, and then she realized it wasn't dark out like it was before. So she lived in the area. She had heard about this apparition, so she assumed, this was the Phantom of Brook Street that people had talked about. So a lot of people in that area, especially old timers, they've heard this story. But the most interesting encounter I heard about was from a woman who lived in an apartment nearby on Brook Street in the 1980s, and her name's Rhonda. I haven't talked to her in years. She's, I think, in New York City now. But she was renting an apartment in a big house on Brook Street, and it was one of the big old mansions that had been chopped up. But this one was one apartment on each floor, so there were three different units. And she said she had heard about this. Her family was from the area. Her family lived in a condo near Central Park, though. But she came home one night. She had had her classes and stuff, and she would always jog in the evening. And she came home one night, and she was in her kitchen making something to eat, and she heard like a rapping at her window by the sink. And she kind of went to the window and looked out, and there was no one there. And she wasn't surprised because a lot of the houses in old Louisville, they're built on foundation. So, a window on the first floor, the chances are it's 6 or 7 or 8 feet up, above street level. And, she couldn't figure out where this rapping was coming from. And then all of a sudden she heard like a shriek, like it sounded like a woman screaming. And she turned around and she couldn't find out, where it came from. But she finished what she was doing, just kind of shook her head, and then she walked into her living room. She was cutting through to the bedroom, and she noticed that the fireplace pokers that she had at her fireplace in the living room, someone had taken them and laid them out in the middle of the floor in a cross formation. And she didn't know, what was going on. So she picked up the fireplace pokers and put them back. She thought maybe they just fell out of their holder, but it kind of creeped her out. But the thing is, from that point forward, she started noticing weird things happening in her apartment. And it got to be so bad that one night she was asleep. She woke up and she heard this terrible shriek like she had heard in the kitchen. And she got up, went into the kitchen, and she could hear like running on the stairs. And the thing about her apartment was in her kitchen, she had the door to the stairs that were the old servant stairs. And the way the stairs were laid out in her house, from her kitchen, the stairs went up all the way to the third floor, kind of in a straight line. But when it was turned into apartments, they just closed off the door at the second floor landing, so you couldn't go in there. And they closed off the door at the third floor landing, so you couldn't go into that apartment. And so she had this whole length of staircase that was hers, that she used for storage. And she said she didn't really go up there, but like the bottom step she would use like to keep potatoes, and she had baskets and things of food, like vegetables and stuff. But she went into the kitchen and she realized this noise she heard was coming from the stairs, and it sounded like someone was running up and down the old servant stairs. And she opened the door, looked inside, and as soon as she opened the door, the running stopped, the steps stopped. And she could see all the way up to the top landing at the third floor. There was just like a bare light bulb there. But she, didn't know if she wanted to go check it out, but she did go up and she tried, you could see the doors that were up there, but they had been sealed. They had been kind of, closed off. But she went up there and there was nothing there. And so for the next 2 weeks, weird stuff started happening. And it got to be so bad that she had friends come and stay with her. And her friends staying with her, they started hearing this, these weird shrieks. And she had several people staying over one night. And she woke up one night because her friend in the room next door was screaming. She ran in there. And the friend said someone had yanked her, blanket off the bed. And they went into the kitchen because they heard all this noise. And as they cut through the living room, there the fireplace pokers were laid out in the shape of a cross in the middle of the floor. And she said she heard the running going up and down the steps like she had heard before. She said every time she heard the running, after that first time, it seemed like they got more intense, like the footsteps got louder and more insistent. And she and her friends were standing there, and they looked at the door that went into the servant stairs, and they could see the door handle just kind of turning slowly around and around and around. Well, one of her friends, who wasn't afraid, she grabbed the door and yanked it open. And as soon as they yanked it open, uh, the noise stopped. But they said like a basket came tumbling down the steps and it just landed at their feet, like upright. And her friend grabbed a flashlight, ran up there. It turns out the light bulb had burnt out, and her friend went up and checked the landing on the second floor and the third floor, and there was no one there, and there was no way anyone could have been there and gotten in or out. So the next day, Rhonda, she knew the neighbors, on the second and third floor, and nope, yeah, that's what Tammy's saying, and she went and talked to them, and she said, have you guys been hearing anything on, this side of the house? She goes, I've been hearing these weird steps and running, and her neighbors hadn't heard anything. And she even went into their apartments and asked if she could kind of check, where the doorways were that went into the landings. And you couldn't even see them. They were like totally sealed off, like walls had been built over them in the second and third floor apartments. So she didn't, know what was going on. Well, things just kept getting worse and worse, and she tried to be home uh, as as infrequently as possible. But it was one night where she had to be there, and so she had her friends come over. There was a guy and two of her girlfriends, and the same thing happened. They had been drinking wine and having pizza. They went to bed, but they woke up later because they started hearing all this crazy stuff, and they went into the kitchen, and the same thing was happening. They heard like a shriek. They heard the running up and down the stairs, and they even heard like pounding on the window above the sink. And one of the friends was convinced that it had to be someone playing a prank on them, and so they ran out in the backyard to see if they could, find someone who'd been knocking at the window. Well, they went outside and there was no one there, and the whole backyard was kind of fenced in, so it would have been easy to see if someone was there. But while they were standing in the backyard, the four of them, and they were kind of trying to figure out what had been going on, Rhonda looked back at the building, and she noticed in a second floor window there was a shape, an apparition looking down at her, and it looked like a woman, in a maid's dress. She said it was kind of vague, but she was in the window on the second floor, right above the kitchen sink, where these knocks had been coming from. And for some reason, she said it just didn't seem right. Not only did the apparition seem vague, there was just something about that window that she couldn't figure out, like where it fit in, because she had been in her neighbor's apartment up above, and she never realized that there was a window there. And then as she was staring there, her guy friend, he started saying, what are you looking at? He looked up, he saw this apparition, and that's when he said, how can someone be standing in that window? Where is that window? Because they realized that the window would have been on the landing on the second floor where the servant stairs were, because the servant stairs kind of went up along that side of the building, up above the kitchen sink, all the way to the third floor. And they realized there had to be a room or something there that they couldn't account for. So they ran back inside, all four of them. They went into the servants' stairs. They went up and they tried to, they thought, maybe a window had been plastered over. And I know that happened in my house. On the first floor, we had a bathroom that had stained glass windows in it, and they just kind of built a wall over it, and you could actually see the window from the outside, but you couldn't see the window on the inside. So often, especially in the 60s and 70s, where they were redoing these buildings, sometimes they would just, cover things over. And so they went up to the second floor landing, and they couldn't really see any place where a window could have been, but they were kind of feeling like it was old wallpaper and stuff. And one of them noticed that they could kind of see a shape in the wallpaper, and they started feeling around, and the more they pushed, the wallpaper started to give way, and one of them found like a little indentation and pushed, and they found like a little latch that had been covered over with wallpaper, and they pushed and pulled, and eventually they were able to loosen the wallpaper and open a little door, a little wooden door that went into it like a little utilitarian closet that looks like it had been used for cleaning supplies. They found like old mops, and like I said, like old things, like old mops, and there were hooks on the wall, and on one of the hooks they found like an old maid's uniform hanging there, like just tatters. But it looked like it was gray and maybe had like ruffles on it or something. But they even found old newspapers, from the early 1900s. So they figured at one time, the people who redid the house and turned it into apartments, they must have just, covered over that little door, because it was kind of just an extra little room. They said it was like a closet, 4 by 5 feet or something. But after they made that discovery, Rhonda said they didn't have any problems. They never heard those footsteps again. The fireplace pokers didn't move around like they had before. But when I heard that story, that's when I really got my curiosity piqued, because I heard these other stories about the apparition floating up and down Brook Street, and I had talked to people who had gone to Old Male High School, and I did some research, and sure enough, I found out something that I think kind of explains what this haunting could be. And it turns out in the 1880s, a maid was killed not too far away from where all this happened. And the more research I did, the more I found out that this was a huge event back in the 1880s. What happened, it was a day in August of 1887, and a young maid, a 23-year-old maid by the name of Jenny Bowman, she worked at a house and lived in a house with her employers at 1522 South Brook Street. And what happened was, one day her mistress had gone out with the children to go visit some family nearby. The husband, Mr. Johnson, was away at work, and Jenny Bowman, the maid, came downstairs to clean the living room, and she walked in to find 2 burglars had broken in, and they were standing at the fireplace. And she shrieked. They saw her, and they attacked her, and they beat her savagely. Well, when the family came home, the mother came home with the children, several hours later, they found the house just ransacked. There were pools of blood all over the place. Furniture had been upturned. Things had been broken. And they found Jenny Bowman in a bed on the 2nd floor, just barely clinging to life. They had beat her so severely that she was practically dead. Well, they took her to the hospital, and she was still alive, but she kind of languished for several days, and every day the Louisville newspapers would give updates on Jenny Bowman and talk about this brave girl, because she had resisted these attackers, and as she was fighting them off, even though they overpowered her, she was able to grab a shard of broken glass from a wine goblet, and she raked it across the face of one of the guys. And the last names of these 2 guys were Turner and Patterson. And because she had raked this glass across the face of the one guy, she kind of branded him a killer, and they were able to find the 2 very quickly. They arrested them, and the city was in uproar. There were lynch mobs hanging outside of the courthouse. They wanted to lynch these 2 guys. And Governor Proctor, not in Kentucky, he had them moved to Frankfort because they were afraid they were going to be killed illegally, by a lynch squad. Eventually, they were tried, and they were both hung. But the thing is, when Jenny startled them at the fireplace, and when they attacked her, the one guy, he was holding a fireplace poker, and he used the fireplace poker to beat her. And he beat her around the head. Her skull was fractured in 3 different places. They beat her so severely that one of her eyeballs was knocked from the socket. And 2 weeks roughly after this happened, she died. And the city was in a terrible state. They had services for her all over. And they think it's her ghost, the one that haunts Brook Street. And they think that when people have seen her and she shrieked and kind of lifted up her hands to cover her face, it's to hide the fact that half of her face was totally disfigured by this terrible beating. And this is one of those stories where there's a lot of documentation to kind of flesh out the story. But here's one of the newspaper articles that talks about what happened. You can see it says a brutal crime. You see the fireplace poker they used right there. This is one of the pictures of Jenny Bowman on her deathbed. This is one of her bandaged up. That's, they say, what she looked like right here. It's hard to do this thing backwards. But yeah. And the thing is, they're not quite sure why she might have haunted Rhonda's old house, because that's not the place where she worked. It's a couple blocks down from where the building stood. But they think often, these day maids, even if they lived with employers, they would have like side jobs. So they think maybe Jenny Bowman had worked at this house as well. And you won't be able to find the house where Jenny Bowman worked and where she was brutally attacked, because they tore that house down when they put in I-65, and that house, 1522 South Floyd Street, stood directly across from the old male high school. So there's that connection there that's kind of interesting. So that was one of the first stories I ever wrote, and like I said, one of my favorite stories, because there's lots of newspaper articles. There's dozens and dozens of newspaper articles that have been written about Jenny Bowman. When I did my first book signing, by the way, for Ghosts of Old Louisville, one of her descendants showed up. I think he was working in the fire department at the time, if I remember correctly, but he came. I didn't know, I had never met him before, but he had read the story, he knew about it, and so he came, and he actually brought a picture of her gravestone. She's buried in Cave Hill Cemetery. So if you're a Louisvillian, you know Cave Hill Cemetery. It's one of our most beautiful cemeteries in the country, in fact, and a lot of dignitaries are buried there. A lot of, just regular people, including, Jenny Bowman. So this is one of those stories where there's a lot of interesting documentation to kind of put some meat on the bones of the story. So those were the two stories for tonight. So thanks for tuning in. Tomorrow night, we're going to do it. Tomorrow night's going to be a week exactly, so plan on it. Tomorrow night, I'm going to talk about two churches that are allegedly haunted, or at least have weird paranormal activity. One is the Walnut Street Baptist Church, which is on 3rd Street. It's a beautiful limestone Gothic structure with two beautiful spires. It was built in 1902. The pastor who founded it in 1802 was Squire Boone, the brother of Daniel Boone. And there's a strange winged creature who supposedly haunts the tower of one of the towers of the church. They call him the Demon Leaper. So we're going to hear about the Demon Leaper tomorrow night. If you know anything about the Mothman in Point Pleasant, he's kind of a cousin of the Mothman. It's kind of like a bat-like creature who flies. And this is definitely one of the stranger legends. And I found weird newspaper articles that bring in other things like aliens and flying machines back then. So plan on hearing that tomorrow night. And then a couple blocks down on 3rd Street is one of the most famous stories in all of the neighborhood. It's the old First Church of Christ Scientists, which sits at the corner of 3rd and Ormsby. And it's where we have a haunting known as the Lady of the Stairs. And the Lady of the Stairs is a beautiful female apparition who's seen pacing back and forth across the steps of this beautiful church that was started in 1916. And it's one of our most tragic, one of our most romantic ghost stories, and has a definite timely connection because this all took place during the Great Spanish Flu of 1918 and 1919. So tune in tomorrow night and we'll hear those two stories. And then, like I said, a couple nights after, I'll wrap up some of the other stories I know. And one of them, I think the last night, I'll tell you about the house in Old Louisville, the mansion at 1435 South 4th Street, where the night of June 17th, 2010, the police were called to break up a domestic dispute, and they didn't know that this would turn out to be one of the most weird murder cases in the city's history. They went down into the old wine cellar, one of 2 rooms in the basement that still had a dirt floor, and 4 feet below the surface, they found a blue Rubbermaid container in which were buried the remains of Jamie Carroll. And so you'll find out more about how Jamie Carroll ended up there, how he was connected to the 2 guys living in the house, and the whole sad and spooky history of the house. If you're true crime fans, this house has been on A&E. It just turned out the night that the police were called, A&E was in town with their crew for the first 48, and they filmed all this. So that episode is called What Lies Beneath. They came back. They did a special follow-up for the trials. It's called After the First 48. They interviewed me because I'm writing a book about it. And then Investigation Discovery came. Hell House Deadly Sins did stories on it. So if you're a true crime buff, you probably have seen this story on TV. And I'm working on the book, which, if you know anything about Savannah, has been inspired by the famous book by John Berendt, Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And I remember when I first moved to Louisville, and when that book came out, I was like, why don't we have a book like this for old Louisville? We got crazy people in old Louisville. We got eccentric people. We got beautiful old mansions. We got old money. And then we got, this dark, seedy underbelly of any society you're going to find. We've got that. We got drag queens and cross-dressers, we got witches and voodoo people, we got murders. And when this story broke, it fell into my lap. It was the story I had been looking for. And this is the story that keeps on giving, because there's just so many different layers. It's not just murder, there's counterfeit money, there's a kinky sex club. The house was an asylum at one time. We got cross-dressers here. We got leather suits. We got all kinds of stuff. When this story made the news, they started calling this Kentucky's America's horror story house, because all these weird parallels started to emerge. Because at the time, AHS was in its first season on TV. So if you're fans of AHS, American Horror Story, there's a lot of weird similarities with what took place at 1435 South 4th Street and what took place on the TV show. They're not connected in any form. It was just pure coincidence. But people thought it was strange that we did have all these coincidences between these 2 stories. So stay tuned. In a few nights, I'll tell you all about that. But tomorrow night, like I said, tune in, and I'll tell you about 2 churches on 3rd Street. And I hope you're all doing well. Hope the quarantine is going fine so far. I hope you're all healthy and happy. If you can't come do a tour of old Louisville anytime soon, if you're in the neighborhood, promote one of our local restaurants. Amici is great. Bucks. A lot of them are still doing carryout. Adrian Donuts, the corner of 4th and Oak, where we started daytime tours. They're still doing deliveries. North Lime. So try to support your local restaurants and workers as much as you can. Thanks for coming out. You're kind of supporting me by tuning in, and help me promote Louisville Historic Tours. Can't wait till this is all over and I can be out on the streets taking people around and showing them the great architecture and telling the ghost stories at night, and talking about the people in the neighborhood. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all of you who've been helping me out. Sean Stafford, Huntley Media, helping me with my website. My design person, Carrie Sweet. All the Thursday night, Monday night, Tuesday night dinner club people who were there, who witnessed a lot of this stuff as I was writing my books. And all my new friends especially. Love seeing all my Facebook friends. And this is turning out to be a lot of fun. So hope to see you all tomorrow night and for a number of nights afterwards. So take care, keep in touch, stay healthy, and we'll see you all tomorrow night. Okay? Bye-bye. See you.